In the headlines, Washington vows to add more pressure on the North Korean regime by targeting its remaining financial links with the world in retaliation for its alleged cyber attack on Sony Pictures. North Korea hikes up its rhetoric over the South Korea-U.S. joint military exercises. Oil prices tumble to a 6-year low as big OPEC producers stand by their decision not to cut output. And Paris remains on high security alert amid more threats of terror attacks. Charlie Hebdo, meanwhile, says it's increasing the number of its copies for its first edition since the terror attack to 5 million. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the program. Coming to you live from Seoul, I am Kang Chidi. Washington has vowed all possible means to expand the effects of its sanctions on the North Korean regime. This comes in retaliation of Pyongyang's alleged cyber attack on Sony Pictures. Shin Se-min fills us in.
The U.S. is targeting the remaining financial links North Korea has to the international financial system in retaliation for Pyongyang's alleged cyber attack on Sony Pictures late last year. Speaking before members of Congress Tuesday, Daniel Glaser, Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing at the U.S. Treasury, said past sanctions had already stopped hundreds of overseas banks from doing business with the North, but said the U.S. could go further.
So we could target any North Korean government agency, we could target any North Korean government official, and then once so targeted, we could apply sanctions with respect to any individual or entity who's providing them in turn material support, or any individual entity that they in turn control.
Glaser said the U.S. is targeting the North Korean elite source of hard currency and its ability to send back cash through Chinese commercial banks to increase the cost for North Korea. An Sung-kim, the top U.S. official on North Korea, who was also at the briefing, said that Pyongyang is losing friends, even its longtime ally, China.
I think what we have seen in our cooperation with China is that China is working with us more effectively and trying to stifle North Korea's dangerous activities. And it's an ongoing effort. I think all of us need to do more, including China.
Regarding the North's recent cozying up with Russia, the U.S. official said Moscow remains committed to the shared goal of denuclearization. Responding to critics who say the sanctions don't go far enough, Kim said the latest measures are very strong and they'll allow Washington to target anyone that tries to provide material support to the North. Shin Se-min, ARIRANG News.
North Korea, meanwhile, has stepped up its criticism of the United States after Washington rejected its offer to cancel joint military drills with South Korea in exchange for a temporary suspension of its nuclear test. The North has also cautioned the U.S. against meddling in inter-Korean affairs, that is, blaming it for stirring up a confrontation on the Korean peninsula. Hwang Sung-hee reports.
After offering to temporarily suspend its nuclear tests for an end to joint South Korea-U.S. military drills, North Korea proposed direct talks with the United States. In a press conference on Tuesday, North Korea's deputy ambassador to the UN said it was willing to explain the offer, but claimed Washington's rejection reflected its hostility.
The United States has shown once again that they will continue to increase attack military capabilities in the South Korea, while requesting us to not to have our own national defense capabilities.
Seoul and Washington insist their annual training exercises, scheduled for March, are defensive in nature, but Pyongyang sees them as a practice for war. In its state-run Dodong Sinmun newspaper on Wednesday, North Korea advised the U.S. to step out of inter-Korean affairs. The paper claimed that Washington has always stirred up confrontation whenever there were signs of easing tensions on the Korean peninsula. It called on South Korea to work together with the North to counter the American interference. Analysts see this as part of North Korea's efforts to increase pressure on Seoul. President Park Geun-hye and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un had both expressed their willingness to improve ties in the new year. But while North Korea blames Washington for disturbing the mood for dialogue, it has yet to respond to South Korea's offer for talks, which was made over 2 weeks ago. 황성희, 아리랑 뉴스.
Trading volume between the two Koreas hit a record high last year, exceeding $2.1 billion. Most of the items traded were raw materials and finished goods from the inter-Korean industrial complex in Kaesong. In 2013, when the complex was shut down for 6 months due to inter-Korean tensions, the trade volume came down to just a little over $1 billion. Japan says South Korea should not attach any preconditions to their leaders' summit. Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said Tuesday that the issue of Japan's wartime sexual enslavement should not be used politically or diplomatically. This comes a day after President Park Geun-hye called on Japan to change its stance in order to make the summit meaningful and productive in a New Year's press conference. A representative of Korea's ruling party is expected to deliver a message from President Park Geun-hye to Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe on Thursday, tomorrow. Ruling Central Party Supreme Council member Seo Chung-won is now in Japan for a 3-day visit with a group of Korean lawmakers affiliated with the Korea-Japan Parliamentarians Union. Lawmakers say the message is not in the form of an official letter, but will be delivered in person. Now all eyes are on whether this message will include any suggestion of a summit between the two leaders, an event that has never taken place under the current Park administration. The chairman of Korea's ruling Central Party says the party's goal for this year is to revitalize the economy. In his New Year's address on Wednesday, Kim Moo-sung said Korea should not miss this golden time to boost the economy and push through reforms to avoid Japan-style stagnation. The party chief pointed out the need to reform the public pension system, saying the state budget is running tight. He also added the ruling party will work closely with the opposition to ensure state affairs run smoothly. Oil prices have tumbled to near a 6-year low on Tuesday as big OPEC producers stood by the group's decision not to cut output. And it looks like oil prices will only continue to fall. Our Connie Lee has more.
It's another drop in oil prices. Crude prices slumped to almost a 6-year low on Tuesday, with Brent trading around the same level as U.S. crude oil. U.S. crude lost 5% at $45.89 a barrel, and Brent plunged 7% to $46.59. Oil prices tumbled after major OPEC producers such as the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia defended the group's decision not to cut output. Oil prices have dropped 60% in just over 6 months due to rising production such as more U.S. shale oil and weaker demand in Europe and Asia. And if you thought oil prices have gone as low as they can go, think again. Analysts believe the prices will dip even more. In recent days, many global investment banks have cut their oil forecasts, saying the prices need to stay low for longer in order to end a global supply glut. For instance, U.S. bank Goldman Sachs slashed this year's forecast for Brent from about $84 a barrel to about $50. Connie Lee, ARIRANG News.
Korea's exports to China are projected to rebound this year after a poor 2014 that saw Korea's shipments to the world's second largest economy dip for the very first time in 5 years. Connie Kim has more.
Korean policymakers and exporters alike may be heaving a sigh of relief. The country's exports to China are forecast to rebound this year after falling for the first time in 5 years in 2014. Shipments to China are expected to rise 4.5% to $147 billion, according to industry estimates compiled by KOTRA, a state trade promotion agency. This year's rise is expected to be fueled by economic recovery forecasts in the United States, which will boost Beijing's outbound shipments to the U.S. About half of all Korean exports to China are intermediary goods that are used to manufacture finished products that are then shipped off to the U.S. and Europe. Experts also say the free trade agreement between Korea and China that could take effect in the second half of this year will also be a contributing factor.
With the Korea-China Free Trade Agreement, Korean companies will have greater access to the Chinese market where they can target the domestic market.
While sluggish recoveries in China and Europe were mainly to blame, China also improved its own supply capacity of intermediary goods. Experts point out that with the growth of domestic demand in China, Korean intermediary goods will remain competitive in the Chinese market for the time being, but in the longer term, local exporters should come up with more finished goods to stand out from the rest of the pack in China. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
A local research institute has suggested that Korea follow in Singapore's footsteps when it comes to securing more investment from overseas. The Korea Economic Research Institute says while a country's GDP is linked to its ability to bring in foreign direct investment, Singapore, a nation whose GDP is only a quarter that of Korea's, competes for foreign direct investment with countries like the U.S. and China. That was attributed to Singapore's flexible labor market, limited regulations, and low taxes. A UN ranking placed Singapore 6th in terms of foreign direct investment back in 2013, with a total of $64 billion. Korea, on the other hand, was ranked 21st with a total of $12 billion, a GDP to foreign direct investment inflow ratio of 1%. Samsung Group is set to invest around $46 billion this year for facilities and research and development. A Samsung official revealed on Wednesday that this year's amount is similar to what the company spent last year. Samsung Electronics, the electronics arm of Samsung Group, said about $22 billion will be spent on its three main sectors: memory chips, display, and mobile. According to market analysts, the conglomerate has been steadily increasing its investment from about $39 billion since 2011. Now, there is an economic disconnect here in Korea. On the one hand, many Koreans complain that the quality of their life keeps getting worse. On the other, that data shows that the Korean economy is doing okay. Our Kwon So-ah tells us why this might be happening.
The days of growth at a breakneck pace are long gone, and yet the Korean economy has shown steady growth in recent years, even after the 2008 global financial crisis. Even so, there are surveys showing that 8 out of 10 Koreans don't think their life is much better than before.
Life is really hard. It's hard for the unwealthy people. Something must be done about the economy.
Statistics Korea says the size of the country's middle class is contracting. Back in 1990, some 75% of the nation's population was categorized as middle class. Now, the percentage has dropped to below 70. The number of people in the lowest income bracket, on the other hand, has jumped from 7 to nearly 12% in the same period. In the past 24 years, Korean households saw their average monthly income grow 3.7 times at current prices. But that's been dwarfed by a 6-fold jump in GDP. And an average household has to cope with a five-fold hike in costs for fixed expenditures like taxes and insurance during the same period. Some economists say this is due to the nation's companies garnering greater benefits from growth than households. In fact, income from industries accounted for 5% of the nation's total income in 1990 and rose to 10% in 2013. The proportion of income from households, meanwhile, dropped 73 to 66%. But there are other factors too.
When the economy grew by 1% in the past, the employment rate grew by around 0.6%. Today, the rate stands at around 0.3%.
Experts say there needs to be a bigger focus on creating more quality jobs in order to increase consumer spending, which would ultimately lead to higher income for the nation's ordinary people. Kwon So-ah, ARIRANG News.
The number of people who found work last year in Korea made its biggest leap in 12 years. But that does not necessarily mean the country's employment situation or the quality of it is improving. Our Choo-sun reports.
The number of Koreans who found jobs in 2014 jumped a 12-year high. Statistics Korea says nearly 25.6 million people found work last year, up more than 530,000 compared to the year 2013. Looking back at the past 5 years, the yearly increase in the number of people with new jobs had expanded significantly. The country's employment rate also gained slightly to reach a 17-year high of 60.2%. By industry, new jobs were created in manufacturing and health and welfare, while fewer jobs were gained in agriculture, fisheries, and finance. However, experts say a large portion of the newly employed were previously inactive in the economy. Many of them are in their 50s and 60s and have returned to the workforce in temporary positions. That, coupled with a decline in the number of jobs for people in their 30s, shows that Korea's job market remains unstable. In fact, the unemployment rate was the highest for young people from the ages of 15 to 29, jumping to 9%. The unemployment rate has also climbed steadily in recent years. What's even more grim for this group is that 1 out of every 5 young people who found jobs started with contracts of less than a year. A recent OECD report said only 11% of temporary workers in Korea secured permanent employment after a year, and the rest either remained or were let go. 최유선, 아리랑 뉴스.
The French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo has released its first issue to the world since the terror attack on its Paris office last Wednesday. Now, to tell us more, Paul Lee is joining us from the news center. So, Paul, this past week has been a roller coaster of emotions with the deadly shootings, of course, and the massive rallies of solidarity that came after. So tell us, what's been the reaction to this latest issue?
Well, there's been overwhelming demand for the weekly, so much so that the editors have decided to increase the pre-run to 5 million copies. Charlie Hebdo's is hitting back with a defiant issue, complete with a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad on its front cover, which has attracted a firestorm of criticism from the Muslim world. The publication comes as the Al-Qaeda group in Yemen has claimed responsibility for the deadly Paris attack. Our Son Jung-in has the story.
Paris remains on high alert with armed police and soldiers stepping up inspections around institutions, public places, media outlets, and Jewish schools. More threats of terror attacks have emerged in the country, including one from an Al-Qaeda offshoot in North Africa. It threatened to carry out more strikes on French soil if the satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo publishes the latest edition, which has a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad on the front cover. The newspaper has already unveiled the front page of the January 14th edition. It shows a caricature of the Prophet holding a sign that says, "I am Charlie" in French, under the banner, "All is forgiven."
Then there was nothing else but that, this idea of drawing Muhammad, "I am Charlie," and I looked at him. He was crying, and over it I wrote, "All is forgiven." I cried, and it was the front page.
French Muslim leaders urged their community to remain calm and respect the right to freedom of expression. Prime Minister Emmanuel Valls said France was at war against terrorism and extremism, not against Islam. The Muslim community is France's second largest religious group. Meanwhile, separate ceremonies were held in Paris and Jerusalem for the victims of last week's terror attacks. President François Hollande led a solemn ceremony paying tribute to 3 police officers who were killed in the line of duty. In Israel, thousands mourn the passing of 4 Jewish Frenchmen gunned down in an attack at a kosher supermarket on Friday. Son Jung-in, ARIRANG News.
And turning to the United States, President Barack Obama vows to strengthen the country's cybersecurity laws amid news of major hack attacks against American companies like the one that we saw with Sony Pictures. So we saw yesterday that even the U.S. military's Central Command has some holes in its online security. So how is he tackling these breaches?
Well, speaking on Tuesday, President Obama unveiled a proposal for legislation that would toughen up cybersecurity in both the public and private sectors. That means new powers to prosecute cybercrime, a threat the president described as an urgent and ongoing danger.
We're proposing to update the authorities that law enforcement uses to go after cyber criminals. Those who are involved in the sale of cyber weapons like botnets and spyware. The bottom line, we want cyber criminals to feel the full force of American justice because they are doing as much damage, if not more these days, as folks who are involved in more conventional crime.
The Obama administration is said to be already in talks with leaders of the Republican-led Congress, where the related bills will be debated and passed pending bipartisan support. The White House hopes to build momentum for the legislative move ahead of a cybersecurity summit in Silicon Valley next month.
Now let's talk about Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's cabinet's approved a record defense budget adding up to 42 billion US dollars. Now this comes as Tokyo is facing territorial disputes not only with South Korea but with China as well. So give us the breakdown of its defense budget.
Well, Japanese Defense Minister Gen Nakanai says these record funds are needed to deal with what he called the changing situation around Japan. But to answer your question more specifically, the spending proposal will pay for over 20 maritime patrol aircraft and 6 stealth fighters. The $42 billion defense budget represents a 2.8% increase for the fiscal year until March 2016. The year-on-year trend reflects Prime Minister Abe's push to build a more active military and reinterpret the country's pacifist constitution. Meanwhile, China and Japan are trying to ease escalating tensions over a disputed island chain in the East China Sea. The two countries agreed to set up a special maritime hotline to prevent clashes in this area. Not a lot of details have been released, but the two sides agreed to operate the hotline soon, marking their first discussion on the issue in over 2.5 years.
Let's see how that goes. And finally, Pope Francis has kicked off his week-long tour through Asian countries. He's in Sri Lanka today, where he called for reconciliation and the pursuit of truth following the country's long civil war. What else was on the pontiff's agenda?
Well, Pope Francis also beatified Sri Lanka's first saint, Indian-born missionary Joseph Vows, who was captured in Ceylon on accusations of being a spy. He said Christians should follow Vaz's shining example of peace, justice, and tolerance. Addressing hundreds of thousands at a public mass, Francis also stressed that religious freedom was a fundamental human right.
Each individual must be free, alone, or in association with others, to seek the truth and to openly express his or her religious conviction.
This is the first time the majority Buddhist nation has hosted a pontiff since the end of its decades-old civil war in 2009. Chetty?
All right, Paul, let's leave it there for now. Thank you so much for those stories, and we'll see you again in just about 2 hours.
and welcome. I'm Kim Bo-kyung with your weather forecast. We begin with news of showers down along the southern coastline and in Jeju, and it looks like up to 10 millimeters may fall in those areas through later tonight. Seasonal average temperatures at this time of the year is about 2 degrees, but tomorrow's daytime high should peak at a warm 8 degrees. Other than that, cloudy skies will give way to clear conditions for most regions, but it looks like about 5 millimeters of rainfall may fall along the eastern coast. Nationwide, looking ahead, nationwide snow or showers are in store for Friday, which should pull down numbers back to seasonal norms. On to tomorrow's readings. Seoul and Daegu hit 8, Gwangju hits 9, Busan reaches 10. On to other regions. Jeju makes it to 9, Dokdo hits 6, Mount Kumgang -2. Those are the updates we're following at this hour, and more updates coming up after 10.
All right, thank you very much, Bo-kyung, and that will do it for this edition of ARIRANG News at 8. Thanks for watching.